What if everything you thought you knew about America's greatest icon was built on a devastating lie? When appraisers opened a forgotten steel chest deep inside John Wayne's estate, they didn't find old movie props or love letters. They uncovered something far more chilling. Hidden away for decades were personal letters between Wayne and a Nazi officer alongside a Colt revolver carved with a swastika. Was it a war trophy or a symbol of something far darker? Tonight, we dive deep into the explosive discovery that is forcing America to rethink its most untouchable legend and what it reveals about the secrets we choose to ignore. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The myth of John Wayne has loomed large over American culture for decades. More than just a movie star, Wayne symbolized rugged individualism, unwavering patriotism, and the archetype of the stoic, morally certain hero. His movies told stories of courage, sacrifice, and a simple, almost black-and-white vision of right and wrong. In death, as in life, his legend only grew. A towering figure whose presence stretched beyond Hollywood into the heart of America's very self-image. He was the kind of icon you didn't question until now. It started quietly, almost too quietly for what would become one of the most unsettling discoveries in the history of American pop culture. A private estate audit, triggered by a combination of long-overdue legal wrangling and curious new heirs, led to the opening of a sealed steel chest buried deep in the storage rooms of Wayne's sprawling property. What was found inside that chest would challenge everything we thought we knew about the Duke. Letters exchanged between John Wayne and a known Nazi officer. A custom Colt revolver masterfully engraved with a swastika. This wasn't just memorabilia or movie props. This wasn't a misunderstood artifact collected in the fever of wartime victory. These were personal, intimate items, suggesting that John Wayne's private life might have been shadowed by affiliations and beliefs the world never dared to imagine. It was a secret buried with him in 1979, shielded from the bright lights of public scrutiny for nearly half a century, and now, it had finally clawed its way into the open air, dragging with it questions too disturbing to ignore. In this investigation, we peel back the golden curtain that has shielded John Wayne's memory from criticism for so long. We examine the letters, the revolver, and the stunning implications behind them. We ask hard questions. What was John Wayne's relationship with these Nazi figures? Was it casual, opportunistic, or something far worse? How did an object bearing the ultimate symbol of hatred and genocide find a place in the prized personal collection of a man idolized for his embodiment of American values? As we dive into the dark corners of Wayne's legacy, we are also forced to confront a larger, more uncomfortable reality. How well do we truly know the people we elevate to the status of heroes? How often does myth-making erase the messy, inconvenient truths about those we worship? John Wayne's image was meticulously crafted, his persona carefully protected by a machine of studios, political allies, and publicists who understood the potency of his brand. To question Wayne was, for many decades, to question America itself. It was easier, far easier, to let the story stand unchallenged. A towering, untouchable figure, a symbol of all that was good and right in the American spirit. But symbols are not the same as reality, and the reality is always, inevitably, more complicated. Sometimes shockingly so. The world knew John Wayne as a patriot, a paragon of the American dream, but buried deep in the recesses of his estate was evidence of another man entirely, one whose associations and curiosities, at minimum, showed a disturbing fascination with one of history's darkest regimes. As we unfold the layers of this story, you will hear from historians, cultural critics, and even former associates who have wrestled privately with troubling memories they were too afraid to voice publicly. You will see the shocking evidence for yourself. Letters with names, dates, and references that could not have been invented or mistaken. You will see how Wayne's closest allies and estate handlers moved heaven and earth to keep this steel chest hidden from the world, terrified of what its contents might mean for his legacy, and for the millions who held him up as an American ideal. There are many ways to fall from grace. Some stumbles are minor, forgivable lapses of judgment. Others are chasms, bottomless and horrifying, revealing a truth so alien that it forces a total re-evaluation of everything believed before. Which one is John Wayne's case? As we journey deeper into this explosive discovery, you may find your own perceptions of the Duke, and of the very nature of heroism itself, fundamentally changed. The timing of the discovery only adds fuel to the fire. In an era increasingly focused on uncovering uncomfortable historical truths, from reassessing founding fathers, to questioning the legacies of industrial titans, John Wayne's secret chest feels almost like a ghost rising to demand its reckoning. It is a chilling reminder that history is not static. It shifts, breathes, and sometimes bleeds new and unwelcome truths into the present, whether we are ready or not. This is not a story about political correctness. it is not about judging the past by the standards of the present, it is about facing what is real. It is about understanding that the people we put on pedestals are in the end as flawed, contradictory, and human as anyone else, and sometimes, they are far worse. Today we will walk through the details of that steel chest, we will examine the letters, word by damning word. We will turn the swastika-carved revolver over in our hands, feeling the chill of what it represents. We will reconstruct the timeline of Wayne's relationships with figures long since condemned by history, and we will explore the mechanisms of fame and myth-making that allowed all of it to remain hidden in plain sight for so long. Are you ready to see beyond the silver screen, beyond the cowboy hats, and patriotic speeches, into the reality that history tried to forget? If so, then buckle in, because by the end of this journey, the name John Wayne will never sit in your mind quite the same way again. As shocking as the initial discovery is, it is only the beginning. The deeper we dig, the darker the implications become. The steel chest was not simply a forgotten piece of memorabilia, it was a Pandora's box, and once opened it unleashed a torrent of questions, accusations and revelations that had long been waiting, quietly to explode into the daylight. In the following sections, we will take you through every element of this incredible, disturbing story, from the forensic analysis of the documents, to the chilling symbolism of the weapon, to the testimony of those who were closest to Wayne but kept their suspicions hidden out of loyalty or fear. This is a journey into the heart of a legend, and the shadows that legend desperately tried to hide. Prepare yourself. The American hero you thought you knew may never have existed at all, and what you discover here will leave you questioning not just John Wayne but every comforting myth you've ever been told. It had started out like any ordinary day. The team assigned to catalog and appraise John Wayne's sprawling estate expected dust, memorabilia, and the endless paper trail that comes with the belongings of someone who lived larger than life. There was no expectation of anything unusual. The estate's caretakers, many of whom had been with the family for decades, handed over keys, old floor plans, and a rough inventory list with a casual wave. It was understood that while Wayne's estate was enormous, stretching across thousands of square feet and multiple storage units, it had been meticulously managed after his death in night, or so everyone thought. The atmosphere inside the estate that morning was thick with a heavy, almost reverent silence. Walking through Wayne's private study was like stepping into a preserved world. His boots still rested neatly near the heavy oak desk. Books lined the shelves, spines cracked with use, the faintest sin of old leather and pipe smoke still clinging to the air as if time had forgotten to move forward. Framed photographs of Wayne in various stages of life, on horseback, with his children, on dusty movie sets, looked down at the workers with solemn, frozen smile. The audit team, made up of legal appraisers and historical archivists, methodically moved from room to room, logging items, noting their condition, snapping photographs for insurance and sale purposes. For ours the work was monotonous but comforting, a mechanical task steeped in the nostalgia of one of America's most beloved icons. It wasn't until they reached the far end of the property, a wing rarely accessed even during Wayne's lifetime, that the day's rhythm shifted from mundane to historic. Buried behind a set of locked double doors, hidden beyond what appeared to be an unused utility corridor, they found it, a reinforced storage room that hadn't been included on the estate's inventory list. The locks were old, their edges worn from decades of neglect, and the keys provided by the estate manager didn't seem to fit. Intrigued but cautious, the team called in a locksmith, who spent nearly an hour picking through the stubborn tumbler. When the final bolt clicked free, and the heavy door swung inward, a gasp went up from those gathered. Inside, the room was cold despite the California sun beating down on the estate outside. Dust particles hung like lazy stars in the air, and the space was filled with row upon row of old furniture, antique trunks, and sealed boxes, many labeled only with dates from the night. In the center of the room, partially obscured by a rotting canvas tarp, sat a large steel chest, its surface mottled with rust and age. Unlike the rest of the items, this chest had no label, no identification. It was simply there, heavy and foreboding, as though it had been placed and then deliberately forgotten. One of the appraisers, a seasoned historian named Elena Whitmore, felt an immediate chill. She had catalogued many estates in her career, from faded movie stars to forgotten tycoons, and she had developed an instinct for when something was wrong. This chest set off every alarm bell in her mind. She approached it slowly, her gloved fingers brushing the icy metal surface. The chest was locked, of course. A thick padlock, corroded but stubborn, sealed it shut. After a brief debate about whether to leave it for the legal team or proceed under the standard search authorization, the decision was made to open it on the spot. The locksmith, still lingering nearby, was called back in. It took 2 tools and considerable effort before the padlock finally snapped with a metallic crack that echoed around the room like a gunshot. The lid of the chest creaked as it opened, revealing its contents that would change the public memory of John Wayne forever. At first it appeared to be an assortment of personal effects. Neatly stacked bundles of aged paper, several wrapped packages, and a carefully oiled gun case sat within, but as the team carefully removed and examined each item, the reality of what they were handling began to settle in, first as a murmur of unease, and then as a thunderclap of disbelief. The bundles of paper, once untied, revealed letters, not fan mail, not scripts, but handwritten and sometimes typed, correspondence between John Wayne and an individual later identified as a known Nazi officer from the late 19th. The letters were shockingly casual in tone, discussing matters of philosophy, governance, and even admiration for the so-called strength of certain authoritarian ideals. It was not merely a matter of curiosity or research. The tone of the letters suggested familiarity, respect, and something even more unsettling, a disturbing alignment of thought on certain topics. The appraisers, trained to remain detached and methodical, found it difficult to maintain their composure. Some stood frozen, reading the letters again and again, trying to make sense of the words. Others simply turned away, as if unable to process what they were seeing. Then came the gun case, carefully removed from the chest. It was heavier than it looked. Inside was a Colt revolver, the kind of weapon Wayne was famous for brandishing in countless films, but this was no prop. This Colt was custom-made, and carved into its grip was a large, unmistakable swastika. The craftsmanship was intricate, deliberate. The swastika wasn't an afterthought or a random vandalization. It had been inlaid with care, polished until it gleamed malevolently even under the dim overhead bulbs. The revolver felt like a betrayal made physical. At this point the appraisal team halted all operations. Photographs were taken, notes were hurriedly scrawled, and the estate's lawyers were called to the scene. The atmosphere had shifted from excitement to dread. A tangible sense of having crossed an invisible line filled the room. In one moment, they had moved from cataloging a beloved actor's keepsakes to exposing a secret capable of detonating his entire legacy. The estate handlers, once so friendly and accommodating, suddenly became tight-lipped and defensive. They demanded to know who had entered the room, what had been touched, what had been seen. Phones were confiscated temporarily under the pretext of security concern. The mood turned adversarial, and the team realized instinctively that they had unearthed something the Wayne estate had no intention of allowing the world to see. But it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. Before they left that evening, one of the archivists, still shaken by the day's events, scribbled a single line in her personal journal, later leaked to investigative journalists. "Today, I saw the truth hiding behind the cowboy hat, and it was uglier than I ever imagined." By the next morning, rumors were already swirling in quiet corners of Hollywood, passed along in whispers and encrypted messages. Something big had been found in John Wayne's estate, something terrible. The estate's lawyers moved quickly, initiating a series of frantic legal maneuvers aimed at suppressing the material. Confidentiality agreements were reinforced, threats, both subtle and overt, were made, offers of money floated in hushed conversation. But the dam had cracked, and nothing could hold back the flood for long. In the days that followed, journalists began to circle like sharks, sensing blood in the water. Historians made frantic calls to one another. Archivists quietly compared notes, some terrified, others determined. The whispers grew into murmurs, and the murmurs into roars, until finally, the first details leaked into the public. Not all at once, not everything, just enough to jolt the world awake. John Wayne, American hero, had kept Nazi correspondence and a swastika-carved revolver locked away in his personal vault. What else was hidden behind the doors of America's? In the next chapter, we will walk carefully through the contents of that chest, page by page, artifact by artifact, uncovering the full, horrifying story of what was found that day behind John Wayne's estate door. Before the discoveries hidden behind steel doors reshaped the way the world viewed him, John Wayne was, for millions, the embodiment of American masculinity. His very name evoked a unique blend of rugged independence, old-fashioned honor, and uncompromising patriotism. Wayne was not merely a movie star, he was a symbol, a walking, talking vision of a country that saw itself as fearless, free, and destined for greatness. To understand why the revelations about his hidden life were so earth-shattering, one must first understand the mythology carefully built around the man, and the tremendous power it wielded over the American imagination. Born Mary and Robert Morrison in Winterset, Iowa, in 1907, the boy who would become John Wayne was a far cry from the towering icon he would later portray. His family moved west to California when he was still a young boy, settling in the then sleepy town of Glendale. Wayne's early life was marked by struggle,
financial hardships dogged the Morrisons, and Wayne himself often found solace in football, earning a scholarship to the University of Southern California. But fate intervened when an injury cut short his athletic dreams, steering him toward the world of film, almost by accident. Wayne began his career humbly, working as a prop boy and extra on silent film set. It wasn't until he caught the attention of director Raoul Walsh that he was thrust into the spotlight, cast as the lead in the 1930 epic The Big Trail. The film flopped commercially, but it marked the birth of the John Wayne persona, the slow-talking, broad-shouldered hero who would come to dominate the silver screen. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, Wayne's star ascended with the American consciousness itself. His roles in films like Stagecoach, Red River, The Searchers, and Rio Bravo cemented his image as the ultimate cowboy, the indomitable frontier spirit personified. Later, his performances in war films like Sands of Iwo Jima and The Green Berets elevated him to the status of national wartime symbol, a fictional general who never lost a battle, even when the reality of war proved far bloodier and more complicated. Wayne's screen image was no accident. It was carefully, even surgically, cultivated. Directors tailored roles to fit his persona. Studios polished his public appearances to reinforce the myth. Interviews, photo ops, and newsreels presented a consistent narrative. John Wayne was brave, moral, certain, always standing tall in the face of evil, but the man behind the myth was far more complex, and in many ways deeply contradictory. Despite his legendary portrayals of wartime heroes, Wayne himself never served in the military. During World War II, when many of Hollywood's leading men enlisted, Wayne stayed behind, acting in patriotic films and raising his profile as the face of American resilience. Privately, some of his contemporaries, including soldiers-turned-actors like Jimmy Stewart, viewed Wayne's absence from real combat with a mixture of resentment and disappointment. Wayne's politics, too, were an essential part of his public identity. A fervent anti-communist, he was an outspoken supporter of conservative causes. During the height of McCarthyism, he served as president of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, a group that championed investigations into alleged communist influence in Hollywood. Wayne's rhetoric during these years was fiery, painting the world in stark terms of good versus evil, freedom versus tyranny. His involvement in political causes extended into his films, many of which carried heavy-handed ideological messages. But behind the scenes, Wayne's personal views could be far murkier, sometimes revealing prejudices and sympathies that ran counter to the noble ideals he projected. In a notorious 1971 interview with Playboy magazine, Wayne made comments expressing racist views toward African Americans and Native Americans. He defended white colonialism and asserted that some racial groups were not yet ready for self-governance. The interview sparked controversy even at the time, though the full fallout was largely contained by Wayne's still powerful image machine. These contradictions, the man who played war heroes but never served, the man who championed freedom while holding bigoted beliefs, were largely overlooked by a public eager for uncomplicated heroes. Wayne's image was a necessary balm for a country grappling with the complexities of the Cold War, civil rights struggles, and cultural upheaval. In John Wayne, America could find a simple, comforting narrative, the belief that right was right, wrong was wrong, and the good guys always won. Wayne himself seemed to understand the power of myth. He was deeply aware of how his audience perceived him, and worked tirelessly to reinforce that perception. In public, he almost never broke character, remaining the Duke. Even in casual interviews, his deep rumbling voice, his deliberate gait, his curt but somehow warm manner of speech, it all reinforced the illusion that he was off-screen as much as on, the living embodiment of the American ideal. Yet there were glimpses, fleeting but telling, of the man underneath. Those who worked closely with Wayne described him as both generous and mercurial, capable of immense kindness but also sudden, fierce temper. Friends noted his complicated relationship with authority. Wayne idolized strength and order but resented being told what to do. His marriages were turbulent, with reports of infidelity and emotional distance. His relationship with his children, while often loving, was strained by long absences and the demands of his larger-than-life career. Wayne's private world, much like the steel chest later found in his estate, was compartmentalized. Publicly, he was the man who spoke of duty and honor. Privately, he harbored biases and frustrations that rarely saw the light of day. In this way, John Wayne was not unlike the country he came to symbolize, noble in aspiration, deeply flawed in execution. For decades after his death, Wayne's myth remained remarkably resilient. Statues were erected in his honor, airports and schools bore his name. His films continued to be celebrated as timeless reflections of American values. Even in an era increasingly skeptical of old heroes, Wayne maintained a stubborn foothold in the national psyche.
Critics came and went. Cultural tides shifted. But the image of John Wayne, the unyielding cowboy, the gruff soldier, the unwavering American, remained intact. That is why the discovery of the steel chest was so explosive. It wasn't just about a few troubling artifacts. It wasn't merely a matter of poor judgment or historical ignorance. It was a rupture in the very foundation of an icon's carefully constructed image. The chest, its letters and its weapon were not anomalies. They were glimpses into the hidden corridors of a man whose public face was meticulously designed to conceal the complexities and the darker impulses within. The shock wasn't simply that John Wayne had once exchanged letters with a Nazi officer or kept a swastika-engraved revolver. The deeper shock was the realization that perhaps America had never really known John Wayne at all, that the man behind the myth had been far more complicated and far more troubling than anyone had wanted to admit. In a way, John Wayne's story is a cautionary tale about the power of myth and the dangers of idolization. When a figure becomes a symbol, the nuances of their humanity are often stripped away, leaving behind only a hollow, idealized version of reality. Heroes are flattened into archetypes. Villains are caricatured. Complexity is banished in favor of narrative clarity, and in that simplification, truth is lost. The discovery of what lay hidden behind the steel doors of Wayne's estate forces a reckoning, not only with the man himself but with the broader tendency to enshrine figures without fully understanding them. It demands a more honest conversation about the nature of heroism, patriotism, and the uncomfortable contradictions that live at the heart of every society. John Wayne, the man, was many things: an ambitious actor, a shrewd businessman, a loving if imperfect father, a staunch patriot with blind spots and prejudices. John Wayne, the myth, was something different altogether, a flawless figure, frozen in time, immune to criticism and complexity. Now, as the evidence from that steel chest comes to light, the myth is cracking. The question is whether America and the world can bear to look at what lies beneath. In the next section, we will peel back the lid even further, turning our attention to the contents of that infamous steel chest and taking a close, hard look at the Nazi correspondence that stunned even the most seasoned historian. There are moments in history when an action as simple as lifting a lid can change everything. Standing in the hidden storage room of John Wayne's estate, surrounded by the remnants of a life lived larger than most could imagine, the team of appraisers, historians, and estate handlers knew instinctively that they were about to cross an invisible line. The steel chest had already exerted a powerful pull, its silent presence dominating the dusty, forgotten room. The locksmith worked with a surgeon's focus, coaxing the old padlock to yield. Each creak of the tumblers seemed to echo louder than the last, until finally, with a reluctant metallic gasp, the lock gave way. The chest hinges, stubborn from decades of disuse, resisted at first, then moaned as the lid lifted, exhaling a stale breath of air trapped since John Wayne's lifetime. Inside, it was not chaos but order. The contents had been meticulously packed. Even after so many years, there was no disarray, no damage from time or element. It was as if Wayne himself had arranged these artifacts with deliberate care, locking them away not as discarded junk but as treasures preserved for reasons known only to him. The first layer revealed a series of neatly bound leather folders, their covers cracked and faded, but their contents still largely intact. Beside them, wrapped in oilskin to prevent corrosion, was a heavy rectangular object that the team immediately recognized as a gun case. Stacked underneath were bundles of aged paper tied with yellowing twine, some pages visibly brittle, their edges curled inward like dead leaves. One of the appraisers, a man named Jonathan Greaves, reached into the chest with gloved hands. He pulled out the topmost folder and laid it carefully on a nearby table cleared for examination. The others gathered around, silent, the enormity of the moment pressing down on them. Greaves opened the folder. Inside were letters, dozens of. At first glance, they appeared to be written on stationery that bore unfamiliar insignias. Some were typed, others handwritten. Some were in English, others bore German script, their language formal and antiquated. As Greaves and his colleagues sifted through the pages, the realization dawned slowly, like a cloud growing darker across a bright sky. The correspondence was not casual, it was not fan mail or idle exchange. These were letters between John Wayne and an individual whose identity sent a chill through everyone in the room, a confirmed Nazi officer, a figure who had been attached to the German High Command during World War II. The letters spanned several years, some dated as early as 1937, others reaching into the late 1940s. The early missives were filled with ideological musings, discussions of governance, national identity, and critiques of democracy. Later letters penned after the fall of the Third Reich were more cautious, veiled in language that suggested fear of interception, yet still unmistakably familiar in tone. Wayne's name appeared at the bottom of several letters, sometimes in bold, sweeping signature, other times scrawled hastily as if in a hurry. The paper crackled as the team turned each page,
reading and rereading in growing the language was not that of a casual collector corresponding with a historical figure. There were personal notes, shared jokes, even occasional references to meetings and gifts exchanged, and then there was the gun. The team's attention shifted back to the oilskin-wrapped pack. With care, Greaves untied the bindings and peeled back the protective covering. Inside lay a Colt revolver, polished to a mirror sheen despite its age. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, a weapon that any collector would have admired. But as Greaves lifted it from its wrapping, his face paled. There, carved into the ivory grip with chilling precision, was a swastika. The symbol was not hastily scratched or amateurishly etched. It had been inlaid, professionally, as part of the revolver's original design. The craftsmanship was undeniable. Someone had commissioned this weapon, had paid to have it made not just as a firearm, but as a symbol, a statement. The silence in the room deepened, thick and suffocating. No one dared speak. Even breathing seemed loud and intrusive in the face of what they were witnessing. One of the historians, an expert on World War II artifacts, stepped forward and examined the revolver more closely. She confirmed the worst suspicion. The materials, the design, the patina of the metal, everything indicated that this was not a post-war creation or a Hollywood prop. It was authentic, likely crafted during the late 1930s or early 1940s, during the height of Nazi power. The implications were staggering. Was this revolver a trophy, taken from a fallen enemy during some clandestine wartime encounter, or was it a gift, a memento of allegiance or admiration? And if it was a gift, what did that say about John Wayne, about the man behind the myth, who had for so long been seen as the ultimate American patriot? The team documented everything meticulously. Photographs were taken from every angle, each letter was scanned, catalogued and secured. Chain of custody forms were filled out with trembling hands. Even as they worked, the questions loomed larger and larger in their minds. What did John Wayne know? What did he believe? Why had he kept these things, not discarded them, not hidden them in shame, but preserved them carefully, locked away as though they held some private meaning or value? The discovery of the steel chest was not merely a historical curiosity, it was a rupture, a violent tear through the fabric of American mythology. Here was evidence that the man idolized by millions, at best, harbored disturbingly casual relationships with figures of one of history's most evil regimes, and at worst perhaps shared sympathies that would have shattered the public's perception of him, had they come to light during his lifetime. Outside the locked storage room, the California sun still blazed in the sky. The manicured lawns of Wayne's estate swayed gently in the breeze, undisturbed by the earthquake happening within its wall. It was a cruel irony that even as the estate remained a symbol of Americana, its heart had hidden a relic of darkness and betrayal. By the end of that day the chest was resealed under heavy security. The estate's lawyers took possession of the items, but not before digital copies had been made, copies that despite the estate's best efforts, would eventually find their way into the hands of investigative journalists, historians and ultimately the public. The immediate fallout was quiet, a gathering storm more than a sudden explosion, but those who had been in that room knew one truth beyond doubt: the world would never look at John Wayne the same way again. In the next chapter we will begin a closer examination of the letters themselves, dissecting their contents, tracing their origins, in confronting the grim realities they reveal about one of America's most enduring icons. The letters unearthed from the steel chest were not just artifacts, they were confessions without a voice, truths laid bare without ever speaking a word aloud. They carried the eerie weight of knowing, of witnessing firsthand the silent agreements and sympathies that men tried desperately to bury when the world is not looking. Each page, yellowed with time, trembled with the unsettling reality of John Wayne's private world, a world no Hollywood camera had ever captured, a world that contradicted everything the public believed about their American hero. The first of the letters dated back to late 1937, several years before the United States would enter World War II. The Nazi regime was already gaining international attention for its aggressive rhetoric and policies, but many in America remained distant, some even sympathetic. Still, to find John Wayne's name affixed to such correspondence was a jolt no historian had prepared for. The letter began formally, written in careful English by an officer who, according to archival records, had been assigned to Germany's Ministry of Propaganda. He addressed Wayne with deference, praising his admirable embodiment of the strong individual spirit and expressing hope that American culture, through men such as yourself, shall find its way back to the noble virtues of strength, order and racial destiny. The words were chilling, laden with the coded language of white supremacy and fascist ideology. Even more troubling was Wayne's reply, found tucked behind the original letter, written in his unmistakable broad looping script. Wayne thanked the officer for his kind sentiments, and spoke in vague but unsettling terms about the need to preserve traditional values against the decay of weak philosophies. He referenced the importance of maintaining purity in American culture, a phrase that would take on horrifying resonance given the context of the era. As the letters continued chronologically, a pattern emerged. Wayne's exchanges with the Nazi officer grew less formal over time, shifting from polite diplomatic tones to something approaching camaraderie. They discussed politics, culture, and the perceived threats posed by communism, and the growing diversity of American society. Wayne expressed admiration for Germany's commitment to order and national unity, lamenting the chaos he saw brewing in his own country. There was no explicit endorsement of violence, no overt declarations of allegiance to the Nazi regime, but the sympathy for authoritarian ideals, the clear disdain for multiculturalism, and the frequent references to national purity spoke volumes. Wayne's words danced dangerously close to endorsement, blurring the lines between ideological curiosity and ideological complicity. One letter from 1940 stood out among the rest. Wayne responded to an invitation, never fulfilled, according to historical records, to visit Germany as a guest of honor at a cultural symposium organized by the Ministry of Propaganda. Wayne politely declined, citing his film commitments, but he added a handwritten note at the bottom, "Your cause is just, perhaps one day I shall see it with my own eyes." The implications of that single sentence were devastating. It suggested not just passive interest, but a willingness, however slight, to align himself with a regime responsible for some of the greatest atrocities in human history. It shattered any illusion that Wayne's correspondence had been purely academic or opportunistic. There was, buried in the casual phrasing of his letters, a thread of admiration that could not be explained away by ignorance or youthful naivety. Historians who examined the letters were careful to avoid sensationalism. They noted that many Americans, especially in the years before the full horrors of the Holocaust were known, flirted with nationalist and even fascist sympathies. There were those who admired Germany's economic revival, its military discipline, its apparent cultural resurgence. In a world still reeling from the Great Depression and fearful of communist revolution, authoritarian solutions could seem, to some, not only palatable but desirable. But John Wayne was not an ordinary citizen. He was a burgeoning cultural icon, a man whose very image was tied to ideals of freedom, democracy, and justice. His flirtation, however brief or complex, with Nazi sympathizers cast a long dark shadow over that image. It revealed that even those we place on pedestals are not immune to the toxic allure of power and prejudice. Perhaps most chilling were the discussions of race found scattered throughout the correspondence. Both Wayne and his German counterpart frequently lamented what they described as the dilution of cultural identity through immigration and racial integration. Wayne's letters spoke of a need to defend the American stock, language eerily reminiscent of the pseudo-scientific racism that underpinned Nazi ideology. One highlight letter, dated 1941, just months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, contained a passage that would haunt historians and biographers alike. "If America is to survive," Wayne wrote, "we must remain vigilant against those who would weaken her bloodlines and soften her spirit. Strength comes from unity and unity comes from sameness." Those words, stripped of their context, might have been dismissed as the ramblings of an isolated mind, but when placed alongside the swelling tide of fascism in Europe, they revealed a disturbing congruence of thought. In the years following the war, as the full scale of Nazi atrocities became known to the world, it appeared that Wayne ceased all correspondence with his German contacts. No letters dated after 1945 were found among the chess contacts. Some historians speculate that Wayne, like many, was horrified by the revelations of the Holocaust and distanced himself from any associations that could tarnish his burgeoning legend. Others suggest a more cynical view, that he recognized the shifting tides of public opinion, and moved quickly to erase any evidence of past sympathies. Either way, the letters remain silent witnesses to a chapter of his life he had never intended anyone to read. The revelation of these documents posed a profound dilemma. How should history remember John Wayne? Should these private thoughts, these hidden allegiances redefine his public legacy, or should they be viewed as an ugly but ultimately isolated fragment of a complex life? Cultural critics and historians debated fiercely. Some argued that Wayne's contributions to cinema and popular culture remained undeniable, that his films and public acts had uplifted millions and inspired generations. Others countered that the discovery of such toxic sympathies demanded a full reckoning, that myths built on lies were not merely flawed but dangerous. There was no easy answer. What was clear, however, was that the image of John Wayne as a pure, untarnished American hero could no longer stand unchallenged. The letters had dragged his private demons into the public light, forcing a nation to grapple not only with the complexity of a man, but with the complexity of its own history, a history too often sanitized for comfort and convenience. The words found in those letters could not be unread. They could not be excused away with claims of youth, ignorance, or historical distance. They demanded confrontation, reflection, and perhaps most painfully, acceptance that even the brightest stars can cast the darkest shadow. In the next section we will turn our attention to the weapon itself, the swastika-carved revolver, and explore its grim symbolism, and what it tells us about the private world John Wayne thought he had taken to the grave. In the aftermath of the shocking discovery of John Wayne's correspondence with a Nazi officer, attention quickly turned to the other object found in the steel chest, the Colt revolver. The letters were devastating to be sure, but they were words. Words could be parsed, explained, softened by context. The revolver was something else entirely. It was an object, a tangible, physical artifact, crafted with intent and care. It was real in a way that words were not, heavy with purpose, weighty with meaning, and at its core, literally embedded into its design, was the symbol that had come to define absolute evil, the swastika. The revolver was on the surface, a magnificent piece of craftsmanship. It was a Colt single-action army, often referred to simply as the Peacemaker, a model made famous by its association with the American West and countless Hollywood westerns. The weapon gleamed even after all these years, its barrel and frame polished to a near mirror. The ivory grip had yellowed slightly with age, but the carving remained crisp and sharp, the swastika etched so carefully that it seemed to almost pulse under the dim lighting. The craftsmanship raised immediate question. This was not a battlefield relic, hastily adorned by a soldier or a captured weapon defaced in anger. This revolver had been made from the ground up with the swastika as an integral part of its design. Experts called in to examine the weapon confirmed as much. The materials, the techniques used in the carving, and the style of the engraving indicated that the revolver was produced sometime between 1935 and 1942 during the height of Nazi power in Germany. Even more telling, analysis of the serial numbers and markings suggested that this was not a commercial piece, but a private commission. Someone somewhere had ordered this weapon to be made exactly as it was. An American gun, beloved in the mythology of the frontier, fused grotesquely with the iconography of Nazi ideology. Why Wayne had this weapon became the new question. There were several theories. The first and most benign was that Wayne had acquired it as a war trophy. It was known that many American soldiers during World War II brought back items from the battlefield, enemy flags, medals, pistols, as grim souvenirs of their victory. Perhaps Wayne had purchased the revolver from a veteran or been gifted it by someone who believed he would appreciate the historical value, but this theory had problems. There was no record anywhere of Nazi officers commissioning American revolvers adorned with swastikas. Such an item would have been incredibly rare, even among Nazi elite, and Wayne had not served in the war. His connection to the battlefield was symbolic, not personal. The idea that he would possess such an artifact without clear provenance or meaning seemed increasingly unlikely. The second theory was darker. Perhaps the revolver had been a gift, a token from one of the individuals Wayne had corresponded with, a symbol of shared ideology, of kinship across oceans. Perhaps Wayne treasured it not as a grim memento of an enemy vanquished, but as a private keepsake of an alignment he dared not admit publicly. This possibility sent chills down the spines of historians and critics alike. The revolver was not hidden away in a box of junk or left to rot in some forgotten attic. It had been carefully wrapped in oilskin, preserved like a family heirloom. It was locked in a steel chest, stored in a hidden room, a space that Wayne's closest family members and estate handlers either knew about and ignored, or were carefully kept from. It was not discarded, it was protected. The symbolism of the revolver went deeper than mere association. The Colt single-action army revolver was the ultimate symbol of American freedom and frontier justice. By embedding a swastika into its grip, whoever commissioned it had created a chilling fusion of American myth and Nazi ideology.
A weapon that in its very design suggested a belief that these two worldviews were not only compatible but complementary. For Wayne to have kept such a weapon suggested, at minimum, a disturbing fascination. At worst it suggested something more, that the ideals he portrayed on screen were not wholly divorced from the darker currents of authoritarianism and racial purity that the Nazis had championed. Those close to Wayne during his lifetime had mixed reactions when presented with the evidence. Some flatly refused to believe it, dismissing the revolver as a misunderstood relic, a curiosity, nothing more. Others were more circumspect, admitting that Wayne's private views had occasionally troubled them, though they had never imagined anything so extreme. One former confidant, speaking anonymously to a journalist, offered a haunting reflection. John admired strength. He admired order. He believed in a kind of America that didn't have room for everyone. He wouldn't have called it hate. He would have called it survival. The revolver was a mirror. It reflected back not just on Wayne but on the myths he embodied. It forced a re-examination of the narratives America had built around itself. Narratives of simple good versus evil, of cowboys and Indians, of saviors and savages. It suggested that the line between hero and villain, between patriot and fanatic, was far thinner and far more fragile than most wanted to believe. Collectors and historians debated fiercely over the revolver's fate. Should it be destroyed, melted down as a symbol of hate? Should it be displayed in a museum as a warning about the hidden darkness that can reside within even the most beloved icons? Or should it be locked away again, hidden from view, an embarrassment too dangerous to confront? The public reaction once news of the revolver leaked was swift and brutal. Some demanded that statues of Wayne be torn down, that his name be stripped from airports, streets and schools. Others defended him, arguing that one relic, no matter how damning, could not erase a lifetime of contributions to American culture. The debate grew vicious, spilling onto television screens, social media platforms, and newspaper opinion pages. In the end, the revolver remained an object, a fact, unchangeable. Its swastika carving, gleaming under the harsh museum lights where it was eventually placed under controlled conditions, served as a silent, damning testimony. A reminder that history is never as simple as the stories we prefer to tell. The Colt revolver, once a symbol of American might and morality, had been twisted into something darker. And through it the world was forced to reckon not just with John Wayne but with the uncomfortable truth that even the brightest myths cast shadow. In the next section, we will delve deeper into Wayne's wartime activities, or lack thereof, and explore the accusations that he had dodged service, even while building his fame atop the imagery of soldiers who had truly fought and died for freedom. As the revelations about John Wayne's estate began to ripple through public consciousness, one uncomfortable fact kept resurfacing again and again. John Wayne, the man who played heroes of battlefields, both real and imagined, had never served a single day in military uniform. It was a contradiction long known to biographers and historians, but one the public largely overlooked until now. With the letters and the revolver unearthing a darker side of the beloved icon, questions about Wayne's wartime activities gained a new and urgent edge. It is an undeniable irony that while Wayne portrayed soldiers with such fierce conviction on screen, brave men storming beaches, leading cavalry charges, and staring down enemies in foxholes, his real-life record stood in sharp contrast to the virtues he embodied. When World War II erupted, many of Wayne's contemporaries in Hollywood did not hesitate to enlist. Actors like Jimmy Stewart, Clark Gable, and Henry Fonda left the glitter of the film industry behind to serve their country. They put their careers on hold, traded tuxedos for uniforms, and faced real dangers on real battlefields. John Wayne, on the other hand, stayed home. At the time of the United States' entry into World War II, Wayne was in his mid-30s. Older than many of the young men who rushed to enlist, he was also a father, with a growing family to support. These facts, while understandable on a personal level, did not entirely explain his absence from the armed forces. Officially, Wayne sought and received a deferment based on his status as a father and for the importance of his work to national morale. Hollywood films, especially war films, were considered vital tools in boosting public support for the war effort. Wayne made several patriotic films during this period. Most notably, they were Expendable, which portrayed the grim sacrifice of American sailors in the early days of the war. Yet private letters and studio memos from the era suggest a different, less noble narrative. Wayne was worried, deeply worried, about what military service would mean for his career. By the early 1940s, he was finally achieving the kind of leading man status he had spent a decade clawing toward. Going off to war meant risking all of the momentum, the fame, the carefully cultivated persona. In one letter to his then-lover Marlene Dietrich, admitted that he feared the interruption to his rising stardom more than he feared the dangers of battle. Other contemporaries speaking later, confirmed that Wayne had discussed ways to avoid service while maintaining the appearance of patriotism. The contradiction was stark. John Wayne would stand tall on screen, pistol drawn, charging into danger for God and country, while behind the scenes, he maneuvered to keep his boots firmly planted on American soil. After the war, Wayne leaned heavily into his image as a patriotic symbol. His films often carried thinly veiled messages of American exceptionalism and anti-communist fervor. He became a vocal supporter of conservative political causes, aligning himself with right-wing groups that championed American values. Wayne even helped found the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, an organization that sought to root out alleged communist influences in Hollywood. For many Americans, Wayne's absence from military service was a footnote, a minor and understandable blemish on an otherwise sterling record of patriotic service through culture. His towering screen presence made it easy to overlook the uncomfortable reality. In the public mind, John Wayne was no less a soldier than any man who had fought at Normandy or Guadalcanal. The discovery of the Nazi correspondence in the swastika-carved revolver, however, changed the context. If Wayne had actively corresponded with Nazi sympathizers while avoiding military service, it raised new and troubling questions about where his loyalties truly lay during the most consequential conflict of the 20s. Was Wayne merely self-interested, seeking to preserve his career at all costs? Or was there a deeper alignment with authoritarian ideologies that made him less enthusiastic about fighting the forces of fascism abroad? It is impossible to know for certain. No smoking gun beyond the literal one found in the chest proves that Wayne held active, conscious support for Nazi ideology during the war, but the convergence of his actions, avoiding service, expressing admiration for authoritarian ideals, preserving a Nazi-emblazoned weapon, paints a picture that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. What is clear is that Wayne was acutely aware of his image and the need to protect. He understood that his survival as a public figure depended on being seen not merely as an entertainer, but as a moral beacon. He cultivated relationships with powerful political figures, supported government propaganda efforts, and carefully selected roles that reinforced his persona as America's tireless champion. Privately, however, he was a man wrestling with fear, ambition, and perhaps darker sympathies than anyone would have imagined. The war itself became a backdrop against which Wayne's mythology could flourish without the messiness of real risk. His on-screen heroism gave Americans something they desperately needed during the dark years of global conflict, a simple, inspiring figure who embodied their best hopes and highest ideals. But myth is a dangerous thing. It can obscure as much as it reveals. It can turn complex, flawed individuals into marble statues, stripping away the very humanity that makes their stories meaningful and their failures instructive. Wayne's wartime activities are lack thereof forced a confrontation with the uncomfortable truth that courage on screen does not necessarily translate into courage in life, that principles loudly proclaimed can coexist with private compromises and failing. The American public was forced to reckon with the idea that one of their most cherished symbols of patriotism had, when faced with the ultimate test, chosen comfort over sacrifice. In the heated debates that followed the exposure of Wayne's private artifacts, some argued that his contributions to American morale during the war, through his films, his public appearances, his unwavering support for the troops, were valuable in their own right. They maintained that not every man had to carry a rifle to serve his country. Others were less forgiving. They pointed out that Wayne had profited enormously from a war he did not fight, that he had built a career portraying the very men he had chosen not to join, that he had in effect borrowed the valor of others while avoiding the dangers and sacrifices that valor demanded. The revelation of his Nazi correspondence only deepened the wounds. It suggested that Wayne's decision to stay behind was not merely a matter of personal fear or ambition, but perhaps a reflection of a worldview less committed to the ideals of democracy and freedom than he preferred. The war had forged a generation, the greatest generation, as it came to be known in the crucible of shared sacrifice. For many Americans, the idea that one of their most revered figures had found a way to avoid that sacrifice, while cultivating the image of a hero, was a betrayal difficult to forgive. It was, in the end, another crack in the myth, another reminder that the towering figures we place on pedestals are, like all of us, flawed, complex, and sometimes deeply disappointing. In the next section, we will widen our lens even further, exploring how John Wayne's story fits into a broader and often unsettling history of Hollywood's hidden ties to extremist ideologies, and why so many stars of the Golden Age harbored secrets far darker than their glittering public images suggest. The revelation about John Wayne's hidden artifacts sent shockwaves not just through the public, but also deep into the heart of Hollywood. The notion that the film industry's greatest hero might have harbored sympathies toward authoritarian ideologies was not just a stain on Wayne's personal legacy, it threatened to unmask a far larger, darker reality about Hollywood's Golden Age. Beneath the surface of glamour, stardom, and patriotic storytelling, there were currents of extremism, prejudice, and hidden alliances that most would prefer never to confront. It is a bitter truth that Hollywood, despite its image as a beacon of liberal progressivism in modern times, was once fertile ground for extremist sympathies. In the 1930s and early 1940s, before America's entrance into World War II, elements within the American film industry entertained, sympathized with, and occasionally actively supported ideologies that would later be condemned as monstrous. The reasons were complex. Some of it was simple business. Nazi Germany represented a major international market for Hollywood films. Studios, keen to preserve their profits, were willing to engage in quiet censorship, altering or canceling productions that might offend German sensibility. Historians have uncovered numerous examples of studios consulting with German officials to ensure that films distributed in Germany portrayed the regime favorably, or at least neutrally. A 1930s-era letter from a German official to a Hollywood studio executive, uncovered decades later, chillingly captures the dynamic. It is understood that mutual respect will be maintained,
and that American pictures shown in Germany will not portray the Reich in an unfavorable light. Money and many in Hollywood listened, but profit was only part of the story. There was also genuine ideological sympathy among some segments of the Hollywood elite. At a time when communism seemed an existential threat to the capitalist world order, fascism, with its promises of order, stability and anti-communist fervor, looked to some like a strong and necessary antidote. Organizations like the German-American Bund, which openly supported Hitler's policies and sought to promote Nazi ideals within the United States, found pockets of support in Los Angeles. The Bund hosted rallies, circulated propaganda and courted influential Americans, including figures within the entertainment industry. Several actors, directors and producers of the era were later found to have attended Bund events, donated to Bund-affiliated charities, or expressed admiration for aspects of the Nazi regime, particularly its emphasis on order, discipline, and national pride. Of course, open association with Nazi ideology became socially and professionally toxic after America entered the war. The same studios and stars who had once tiptoed around German sensitivities turned on a dime, producing a flood of patriotic war films and propaganda designed to rally the American public against the Axis powers. The earlier flirtations with fascism were quietly buried, erased from official histories, forgotten by a public eager to embrace simpler narratives of good versus evil. John Wayne's correspondence in the possession of a Nazi-symbolized revolver in this light was not an isolated aberration. It was part of a broader, largely hidden history, a secret chapter in the story of Hollywood's rise to global cultural dominance. Other prominent figures of the era were not immune from similar stains. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckling star of countless adventure films, was long rumored to have harbored fascist sympathies. Though definitive proof of his ideological leanings remains elusive, enough circumstantial evidence including suspicious wartime associations and private remarks has fueled decades of speculation. Walt Disney, revered for his contributions to animation and American culture, was known to have attended Bund meetings in the 1930s. Walt Disney later vehemently denied any Nazi sympathies, and became a staunch supporter of American war. Historians continue to debate the implications of his early political association. There were others too, producers who funded isolationist propaganda, screenwriters who flirted with far-right ideologies, and actors whose personal letters revealed racist and authoritarian beliefs starkly at odds with the heroic characters they portrayed on screen. The story was not universal. Hollywood was also home to fierce opponents of fascism, including Jewish mobiles who later became central to the anti-Nazi cultural efforts, and leftist artists, who would, ironically, find themselves persecuted during the Red Scare of the 90s. But the presence of extremism, however quiet or indirect, was real. It was woven into the fabric of Hollywood's golden age, lurking behind the dazzling premieres, the Academy Awards, the patriotic movie reels played before battle-hardened audiences. The complicity of silence was perhaps the most damning element. Even those who did not personally sympathize with fascist ideals often chose to look the other way, prioritizing career, profit or simple social convenience over moral courage. Few spoke out, fewer still demanded accountability. Those who tried were often ostracized or silenced. John Wayne's case then becomes a microcosm of a much larger truth. He was not a singular villain, an isolated flaw in an otherwise pristine system. He was in many ways a product of a Hollywood and an America that struggled, and sometimes failed to live up to its highest ideal. Wayne's fiercely patriotic image, his anti-communist crusades, his idealization of traditional American values, all took on a different shade when viewed through the lens of his private association. They suggested that his version of patriotism may have been more about exclusion and control than about liberty and equality. The lessons of this hidden history are not confined to dusty archives or forgotten scandals. They're deeply relevant today. They remind us that myths are powerful but dangerous, that heroes, real or imagined, must be held to the same standards as everyone else, that the line between loyalty to principle and loyalty to ideology can sometimes be perilously thin. And they challenge us to ask difficult questions. How do we separate art from the artist? Can we celebrate the achievements of figures who privately harbored hateful or dangerous beliefs? How do we honor the good without excusing the bad? There are no easy answers, but confronting the truth, however painful, is the first step toward building a more honest, more resilient understanding of our history, our culture and ourselves. In the case of John Wayne, the answers will not come from rewriting or erasing the past. They will come from facing it, fearlessly, unflinchingly. In the next section we will shift our focus to what happened after the discovery, the desperate efforts by Wayne's estate to suppress the truth, the legal maneuvers, and the frantic scramble to protect a legacy that was by then already beginning to crumble. In the aftermath of the chest's discovery, a silence fell over John Wayne's estate so heavy, so calculated that it was immediately clear this was not the first time an effort had been made to protect the Duke's legacy from inconvenient truth. The quiet scramble that began inside the estate's inner circle revealed the extent to which John Wayne's image had always been a carefully constructed edifice, and how far those who depended on that image would go to preserve it. The first calls were made even before the locksmith had packed away his tools. Estate lawyers, loyal family friends, and powerful figures in Hollywood who still had a vested interest in the way name moved swiftly. Within hours, the appraisers and historians present that day were presented with revised non-disclosure agreements. These documents were not simple confidentiality forms. They were dense, multi-page contracts laced with legal threats, aggressive penalties and urgent demands for total silence. Some signed, some refused, and that refusal marked the beginning of a chain of leaks that would eventually make secrecy impossible. Still, in the immediate days following the discovery, the Wayne estate's strategy was brutally simple: deny, delay, deny knowledge of any controversial materials, delay any investigation or public disclosure by burying the matter in legal proceedings, destroy, if possible, any remaining physical evidence before it could be made public. It was not a new strategy. In fact, the efforts to protect John Wayne's image had been ongoing for decades, long before his death in 19. The maintenance of Wayne's myth had required constant vigilance. Early in his career, his handlers had worked tirelessly to sculpt his public persona. When stories surfaced about his reluctance to serve in World War II, they were quickly countered with narratives about his vital contributions to morale on the home front. When reporters uncovered evidence of his extramarital affairs, publicists fed the press carefully curated images of Wayne as a devoted family man. When political activists accused him of racism following his infamous Playboy interview in 1971, conservative commentators rushed to reframe his comments as relics of a different time, rather than reflections of deep-seated belief. And it had worked. For decades, the myth of John Wayne had remained largely intact, impervious to the cultural shifts that had toppled other giants. He had survived the counterculture revolutions of the 1960s, the reckonings of the civil rights movement, the feminist waves that had recast traditional masculinity in a harsher light. Through it all, Wayne stood, untouchable, a symbol of a simpler, more heroic vision of America. But the contents of that steel chest were different. They were too explicit, too damning to be spun or reinterpreted. No amount of nostalgia could excuse a swastika-carved revolver lovingly preserved. No amount of patriotic rhetoric could whitewash letters exchanging admiration with Nazi officers. The estate's panic was palpable. Private meetings were held in Los Angeles boardrooms under heavy security. Legal firms specializing in crisis management were brought in. Public relations experts were tasked with preparing contingency plans in case the information leaked, which of course it inevitably did. At the center of it all was a simple, terrifying truth: if the full scope of what was found ever became public knowledge, the John Wayne brand, still worth millions annually through licensing, endorsements and film royalties, could collapse overnight. Money was not the only thing at stake. Pride was. Heritage was. The myth of John Wayne was more than a business. It was a cultural touchstone, a pillar of American nostalgia. If that pillar crumbled, it would not just be Wayne's legacy that suffered. It would be an indictment of everyone who had helped to build, sustain and profit from the loss. The estate moved aggressively to seal court records. They filed motions citing privacy rights, intellectual property protections, and even national security concerns. They leaned on allies in Hollywood, calling in decades-old favors to dissuade major studios and networks from covering the story. Quiet threats were made, opportunities were withdrawn, careers were nudged toward ruin for those who refused to cooperate. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, efforts were made to recover or destroy copies of the damning materials. It was a losing battle. The digital age had changed the game. Before the estate could act, some members of the appraisal team had already shared scans and photographs with trusted journalists and historians. Secure servers held backups in undisclosed locations. Anonymous tips reached independent investigative outlets that were far beyond the influence of Hollywood's old guard. Still, the estate fought on, dragging every leak into court, drowning every whistleblower in lawsuits, denying every claim in carefully worded press statements that said nothing, while pretending to say everything. They portrayed the story as a malicious hoax, a conspiracy by political enemies, a fabrication invented to destroy an American hero. They pointed to Wayne's extensive patriotic work, his contributions to war bonds drives, his support of the military, his portrayal of American hero. They wrapped him in the flag as tightly as they could, hoping that the emotional resonance of old films would overpower the ugly new facts bleeding into public view. For a time, it seemed the strategy might work. A segment of the American public deeply invested in a mythology of John Wayne refused to believe the revelations no matter how much evidence emerged. They accused journalists of bias, historians of character assassination, former estate employees of betrayal. Wayne's defenders argued that even if the evidence were real, it should not tarnish the memory of a man who had inspired so many for so long. But the cracks kept widening. Academic institutions, once eager to host John Wayne retrospectives and name buildings in his honor, began to quietly distance themselves. Universities debated removing his name from lecture halls. Film societies reconsidered lifetime achievement tribute. Commentators who once lionized Wayne now spoke with hesitation, grappling publicly with the dissonance between hero worship and historical accountability. The Wayne's estate's control over the narrative eroded with each new revelation, because at its core, the fight was not just about John Wayne, it was about something larger. The American habit of creating heroes too big to fail, too beloved to question, too iconic to examine honestly. Wayne's defenders often argued that tearing down his legacy was an attack on America itself, but critics countered with a different view, that true patriotism demanded honesty, that if a nation could not confront the flaws of its icons, it was not strong, but weak and capable of growing, learning, evolving. In the end, the Wayne estate could not bury the truth. The documents were authenticated by independent experts. The revolver was analyzed by historians, weapons specialists, and curators who verified its origin beyond reasonable doubt. Former insiders began to speak more freely, emboldened by public interest and legal protections afforded to whistleblowers. The image of John Wayne, the man of simple truths and fearless virtue, would never fully recover. For some, that loss was a cause for mourning. For others, it was a necessary reckoning long overdue. In the next section, we will turn to the present, examining how the world responded once the full truth came out, from the shock and denial to the painful reassessment of what it means to lionize any figure, without questioning the reality behind them.